I love using mythology and fairy tales to tell a story. I think they are the foundations of storytelling, certainly for me. I like to think, who is this fairy tale? What is the fairy tale I'm telling?
Across the globe, storytellers are flipping the script. In books, in film, in TV, theatre and art. I'm Kimberly Lipschus and this is the Storymaker's Rebellion, a podcast about the rule breakers, trailblazers and visionaries who are shaping stories on their own terms. Vicki Madden is a powerhouse storymaker in Australian television. The creative force behind television series such as The Gloaming and the Kettering incident, her art is entrenched in the Tasmanian landscape, including its folklore and its mythology. A trailblazing showrunner, writer and producer, Vicki champions complex female characters and fresh storytelling perspectives. Today, I'm keen to dig into how she became a breaker of barriers, her journey, and why narrative possibilities for women and marginalised voices really do matter to her. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Vicki. I am so excited that we finally got to this.
Yes.
Let's dive on in. So I'm checking in on Bundjalung country in Byron Bay. It's a sunny, wintry day. Where are you right now?
I'm in Lutruwita in Tasmania.
So what if we start at the beginning, and where did you get the call to tell stories? How did they first emerge in your life?
It's an interesting question because you always have to go back. And I think it started right from childhood. Like when I look at old report cards, there was always, Vicki has a propensity to daydream. She loves telling stories, but she's not very good with her math. And my mother was Welsh and she was a perpetual storyteller and her whole life was steeped in superstition. Like she was a really superstitious woman and that played a part in our lives. And she was very much, for telling parables, really, if you do this, this will happen. And they're very much the Grimm's fairy tales, not in the Disney sense, in the real sense. So I think I was very, lonely child. It was a very singular life with just my mum really growing up. And so I think there was a lot of daydreaming, internal storytelling, making up stories. I had a little milk bar on the deck, on our, deck wherever we were living, and very much conjured up stories inside myself, I think, to stave off the kind of loneliness, and then really not socialising that much until I was a teenager when I went to boarding school. So I do think that you're a product of your childhood in that way of how you interpret the world. And for me, very much so, it was Welsh superstitious storytelling, parables and things like that.
And yet it's in your lineage as well. Like you're saying, the Welsh is steeped in storytelling. And if I look at your work, it's so mythological and even just the way you use the land.
Yeah, I think place is probably a central way of me looking at and understanding where I come from and how I grew up and how we all are affected by our home, if you like. For me, the landscape, I realised, had a big impact because, again, of having a very unstable childhood. Mum was a single mum. We drove from place to place, lived in other people's houses, lived in our car. It was a very disruptive childhood. So home becomes, for me, a very central part of my story, but also the danger of what home is, because it's not always the safe place. It's actually a temporary, dangerous place that you always have to be wary of, moving out in the middle of the night, moving along in the car, living in somebody's place where you've got to only stay in one room. So place and the darkness and the gothic nature that I feel in Tasmania of centuries past, of our history, our convict history. I'm very attached to all of that, But then I say that and then I go over to Wales or even the UK and I have a very strong pull over there as well. So I do think that we are the sum of our home. And I've learned a lot about myself through my stories. So that's why I think place, is my biggest antagonist, I think, if you like, in my character.
And when moving forward a little bit, how did you move into film and television?
And so I finished school, and all I could really do was type. And it's the only skill set I had, really. But I had this kind of fascination by this book that somebody, maybe my mother, bought me when I was little, and it was called Cecilia Goes to Television. And she was a newsreader. So I was obsessed with newsreaders. And then when I was in Melbourne, I just went to one of those agencies to get typing work, really. And
As Women Our Age did. It's like become a PA.
exactly. And there was a job in the newsroom at Channel 7. So I did that. While I was there, a job came up at Channel 10 in the newsroom. And I desperately wanted to be a journalist, but I didn't have the qualifications to be a journalist. When I was at Channel 10, Neighbours came from Channel 7. So it was the first time I'd seen a production, if you like. And one of the guys, Peter O'Brien, who was one of the actors on the show, was a good friend of my flatmate. So I got to know him. And he'd come over to my place with his scripts for Neighbours, and he'd leave them on the table while they went out. And I looked at them one day and, I don't know if that happens in your life, but you have that huge adrenaline rush where something is fundamentally just changed in your life. So I waited up till he got home, 2:00 in the morning or something, till he got back. And that was in, our nightclubbing days in our 20s. And I said to him, I said, who does this? Who writes these scripts? And he was like, the writers, I don't know. And he was about to leave Neighbours to go on to Flying Doctors at Crawford's. Crawford's and Grundy's were the two big production places. And it was where everybody trained. And I begged him. I said, could you ask whoever how you get into to be a writer? And to his credit, he did. A week later, he gets in there and he gives me this number of this older lady who was a head of HR. I got an interview. I rang her every day to the point where she saw me just to shut me up, I think. And there was a job. But when I got to Crawford's, that's when everything changed. And I caught up with the scripts really quickly because I was going through the night. And I went up to what was a story producer at that time without understanding the way protocol worked, and said to him, this script's not very good. And he's like, really? Would you lie? And he said, well, how would you fix it? And I told him. The next morning I got called into the producer's office and I was like, maybe I wasn't meant to do that. Maybe I'm about to be fired. And I was so upset. And I went in, sat down. The producer goes, so I hear you're not happy with one of the scripts. And so I was really backpedaling, going, no, I love all of them. But, and he said, well, tell me. And Andrew, the story producer, said, tell him what you told me. So I just went through thinking now that I was in so much trouble. Anyway, after that, they called me in and they offered me a training I was the last person writer trained through the Crawford system. So for the next 4 years, everything I did was training on the job. I was on the Flying Doctors for 3 of those years, but I spent so much time on set learning what all the heads of department did, learning to edit, and I desperately wanted to be a writer. And the guy that came in as a new story producer, he recognised something that, again, absolutely influenced my life. He said to me that I could write a script that wasn't going to be aired. It was just for him. And it was terrible. And he said, all right, he said, this is what I'm going to tell you. You've got this really amazing natural talent as a storyteller, but you've got no talent as a writer. So you're going to stay in the story department with me and I'm going to hone your storytelling skills and you can learn to write, because it's easier to learn to write than it is to tell stories. I was so upset. I wouldn't talk to him for like 3 days because I wanted to be a writer. If he had just let me out and gone, okay, be a writer, I wouldn't be doing what I do. And the big lesson out of it for me that I always try and talk about to people, because it's a fundamental issue we have, is it's 2 different jobs. To be a storyteller and to be a writer are completely different disciplines. And I often say to people, if you've got a natural talent, definitely hone that first. It took me years to really right.
It just sounds incredible the way that he went, I see what you have and I'm going to mentor you.
Yeah. And he was fundamentally the biggest influence on my career, and we're still friends, but he just taught me to be patient and to learn skill sets, like it is an art and a craft and a business. There's three key elements, and you just have to know enough about all three to work in the business as a freelancer.
And how did you get from, where was the leapfrog that took you over the shores back to Blighty?
So I worked for a few years on different shows, and I desperately wanted to work on Halifax FP. It was the show that I absolutely held in regard in Australia to be the best show in Australia. It was 90 minutes, telemovie style, but I loved the subject matter, but I also loved the quality of the show. So I'd pester the Roger Simpson, Roger LeMessurier, and then another guy that I'd worked with went in as the story producer, and he brought me down as a script editor. So I worked with them and then became the story producer. Then Channel 9 decided they couldn't afford to make it anymore. It was winding up. But Linda LaPlante, who was probably at that point in my life the biggest iconic hero I had in the world. And, she'd made Prime Suspect, which was, this complete gender-defying role, and changed television and changed the way that we perceived female leads. And she had seen Halifax, and she expressed interest in trying to develop it for her company, for a UK company. So Roger Simpson took me over to the UK for a month to work with her, which was life-changing for me. I came back to Australia, Halifax had finished, and I just got this random email from Linda LaPlante's office. And she said, "Hey, why don't you come over here and work with me for a while? So grab your kit and come on over." And I was going through a divorce, so it was just that moment where the door opens and you just have to make that choice. Now, it was a big thing for me to move so far away from my home. But I knew instinctively I had to do it, and that first 3 months were the hardest 3 months I'd ever lived, trying to live in London without any money, really. And I had this little bed sit that was so cold. You could pay for heating, but only stayed on a couple of hours. It was immensely expensive. So I'd wake up literally with frost sitting on my blankets. I was frozen to the bone, and I knew nobody, and trying to get into the tubes, trying to get to work in winter. It was really, really hard. That began the journey. I got on really well with Linda, and she, again, helped me. She said to me, "You really remind me of a younger me," which was, I couldn't get a better compliment. But again, she's a storyteller fundamentally. So she kind of took me to the next stage of that, and studying her work and the way that she had these absolutely compromising female leads in everything she did. And she didn't believe in mamby-pambying women. That show still stands up as still to this day would be one of the best examples of strong female leads. And then from there, the bill was looking to resurrect itself. Jackie couldn't believe how much I knew about police procedure, because in Australia, you do your own research, with the police. You don't have all these researchers that they have over there. So she recommended me to the bill, and then I stayed there for 2 seasons. And then by then I was really finding my feet. And so I kind of had to oversee the entire department, which it was the biggest script department in the world at the time. Didn't do my research on that, but there was like 35 writers, 15 script editors, and I had to oversee the budget and come up with 10 big storylines a month with the producer at the time. And it was nerve-wracking and it was overwhelming. But while I was there, I was starting to really find myself and find my confidence, and I really have that responsibility of the start of the showrunner model for me. And it was while I was in Ireland, I went to see some Irish films. They show at the Independent Film Commission, or IFC. And I met this guy who'd written the most depressing film I'd ever seen, but very truthful, because a lot of the Irish writers, they still write about, their inherited trauma from, going back from the Troubles and before that. And so it was a very sad story. I was like beside myself by the end of it. I felt like I'd watched a really harrowing documentary. Anyway, we got into this conversation and he asked me what was my story as a writer, if you like. And I kind of said, I just write for hire and I like crime. And he's looking at me like I'm slightly missed the point of the question. And he said, yes, but what's your story? Like, what's your big story of your life? Why are you a writer? And I swear to God, I sat there and never felt so stupid because I just couldn't answer it. I made a really fundamental decision that night. So I resigned a few weeks later, decided to come back to Tasmania and find a story that was about my life. That's eventually became the Kettering incident.
And when you came back, Vicki, what was it like coming back here? Was there a difference or?
Yeah, it was a big difference. Partly I couldn't get work because if you go away and come back, there's a little bit of the tall poppy syndrome and it's very cliquey here and you have to fit in, and I didn't really have contacts anymore. And the first breakthrough I got back here was Two Davids. I always work with Two Rogers, Two Davids, and they had a telemovie that was a true crime story based on a book. And they asked me if I wanted to have a go at this telemovie, and I did. And I loved it. It's true crime is one of my favourite things to do. And that sort of got me back in the door. But it was still really slow because I didn't want to start working full time. I had this determination that I wanted to write a series.
Yeah. So what were some of the differences that you saw in working in the UK and then coming back to Australia at that time?
So the big difference when I got back here is how everybody insisted you live in the state that you're working in. You had to be in the writer's room in there, whereas I'd been working for the past few years on Skype. And the same with the bill. There was a couple of writers. They'd live in Norwich, Manchester. So you're not going to, travel everywhere. It was just the way it was. So I am down here in Tasmania thinking, well, we can do it down here because it's like Ireland. There's a sea between us.
And Kettering is very much a Tasmanian story, yes?
That's what I was fixated on. I wanted the Kettering incident to be 100% in Tasmania because I honestly thought probably be the only thing I ever do. I don't know what it's going to be like. I was trying to find ways to tell stories differently. And a lot of my work is to do with grief, the trauma narrative, but I don't like watching shows myself where people are tortured with grief and they have these big conversations. So I watched this show in the UK called Life on Mars, and it's a time travel show. And it began when three writers in the UK, three guys, said, let's do a time travel show. So it literally was a crime show sitting in two time frames. And the guy that it starts with, Sam Tyler, gets hit on the head and he goes back to 1973. But the crime that he was dealing with in present day started back then. It made me change the way I told stories. I thought we've all got to break away from this stock standard storytelling because not everyone's going to be into your witches or ghosts or whatever, but you've got to have something that has still got a strong familiar narrative. So I tend to, tell a crime story and then bring in the mythology to deal with the grief or to deal with the emotional impact of that crime, if you like.
So you bring it in through the side door?
I bring it in through the side door or up through the murky mist.
Up through the murky mist. And that is very relevant as well because it's a rebellious way of telling stories. How was the idea received? Because you are shaking up the norm.
It was amusing, and I take my hat off to Foxtel for taking it on. So a few things were at play. I met Vincent Shan, who was a Sydney producer, And he said he'd love to do something in Tasmania. And I said, well, I have this story. I'm a bit obsessed with UFOs. I don't know why. So Vincent and I worked together. I think we first took it to the ABC just as a soft kind of pitch to see how it would be received. And the notes back were very stock standard, like we like the crime elements, but what is this? There's a lot of notes. And a lot of people give notes from various elements.
So, after receiving feedback such as that, did you ever feel like handing over creative control, if you will?
I was absolutely determined that I was going to run the show, run the show creatively, as in be involved in all the decisions that we're going to make on casting and wardrobe, everything. I'm just going to be the head.
How was that received?
It was difficult. It was a challenge. It was a challenge for everybody. It's very hard to put yourself forward and say, I deserve this, or despite all of you thinking I can't do this or I shouldn't do this, I'm going to do it anyway. It was very difficult. I got really high blood pressure. I was very stressed. It was really, really, really difficult in some areas just to know that, people would bypass me and go somewhere else because that's what they're used to, and me having to step forward going, no, sorry, but. And Vincent was really good, and Foxtel were really good, and slowly it got better, but it was hard to say, yes, I'm a writer and I've got the producer credit, but I'm a showrunner and I will be in the post-production as well, which was kind of unusual.
And on set.
Pardon?
And on set.
And on set. But being in all the conversations, and I missed some conversations because I wasn't invited in. And it's very distressing when you have to keep putting your hand up. And I wouldn't say it was purposeful or mean. I think it was just new. And I had to navigate my way through, as did other people. It's been a long journey, let me tell you.
I don't know if you saw the video of the Story Academy in Denmark, and they had a conference where they invited Fanny Herrero, who was the Call My Agent showrunner, and she said that she broke her heart sitting at the huge story table. She was the head writer, and she was sitting in the corner. And it's a real sense of strength that I see in your story and her story. So why don't we go into that experience of what it took to kind of wrestle the term showrunner, which is so relatively new back then. It still is.
Still
But
is.
experience of that.
Showrunner is a term that is used in America. So the reason I used it was because I just didn't want to be given a producer credit where it wasn't going to mean anything. And a showrunner is a person in America, is a person who has autonomy over the scripts, who has autonomy over the creative decisions made on the show. And some say, they've got autonomy over the entire show. Not all of them do. That's a bit of a myth. But the showrunner model is a particular role. And I couldn't think of another name at the time. And I knew that the only way I could describe what I was going to do was to use that term. And so there was a few writers that poo-pooed it. It certainly shook up the place because when change comes like this, everybody panics and thinks they're going to lose their power. So, and when you are trying to change something, of course you have to speak out about it. So it sounds like you're being, self-centered, but what can you do except to stick by your guns, and you have to take it on the chin. And the reason why I want control is because I have worked on enough shows that have fallen over by being in the writer's room, fallen over and watched story producers take the flak, even though that story producer had no voice, and producers be so panicked about you wanting to please the network because the network will take you off air or fire you, that they just give you the notes and go, you have to do these notes because they're from the network. And the notes you read them, they make no sense at all. I saw so many shows just fall apart, not from the fault of the writers, but from the fault of the system, the business side of things. And when you work overseas, it's completely different because the writer is far more respected, and the writer is responsible for pitching the story. And you can talk to networks and explain what you're trying to do. All I need to hear is what is the problem, but if you tell me what the problem is, I can fix it. So that's why I wanted to do the role. However, the other side of it is you really want to have this immersive relationship with the director, because they're the two creatives, the writer and director, the two creatives that are going to work together to bring this onto the screen. But in Australia, for some reason that goes way back to the beginning of TV in Australia, is that we took on a film kind of model, which is the producer and the director become very tight. And the writer's over here like a mushroom in the corner. Now that's more how films work. Like films, it's Steven Spielberg film, despite the fact that the writer has written it, it's the director who's king, if you like, or queen. And in TV, that doesn't work. You can't have different directors coming in, putting their own style on one story, one arc story, if you know what I mean. You can when it's episodic, but when it's streaming, it's more important that one auteur voice, be it a director or a writer, has to do that role. And that's where I think we got it wrong for so long. And so I just kind of felt this is much better that I collaborate closer with the directors and the heads of department, so we're all inclusive. But just as there was a sense of, oh my God, she's going to take over and she's not going to let anybody tell her what to do, which is so far from the truth. Because I tell you, anybody got a better idea that can make a scene work better than me, I'm having it. I'm taking it.
So what I'm hearing is you're working in service to the story, and bully for those who think that you're doing it for an ego, that's their problem. But it's interesting that US structure, which has just been formalised in 2023 in the Writers Guild strike, that Denmark and Northern Europe are running ahead with it. They've got training programs at Story Academy Denmark and in Köln in Germany and Gothenburg. And what I'm seeing from my research, it's women who are claiming the story runner title, because otherwise you guys are going to mess with my baby before it's even been birthed.
Yeah.
And
I mean, if there was another title that we could come up with in Australia, that would be good. And, there are people in Australia that kind of have already been writing and producing way before for me, but they never took that title. They do now, but, I get tired of trying to push my own barrow. I think I've got a lot of support, don't get me wrong, but man, it gets tiring having to fight for my place at the table all the time. And that is in most of the work I do is in the UK.
And so along those lines, with the Kettering incident, did you have women who had your back that made you step up to the platform and go, okay, it's not going to be recognised unless I just take a step forward a little bit? Did you have any situations like that?
I did. I did. I had, interestingly, on Kettering, Penny Wynne was in Foxtel, and I hadn't met Penny before, and she was head of drama, and along with Brian Walsh, and they were both very supportive, and she and I formed a good bond because she would give notes, and because I was telling such an unusual story as well and finding my way, there was a lot of back and forwards. But at the end of the day, she had my back, definitely, especially with some areas that I needed support.
Yeah, and failing that, I mean, having the confidence is something worthy of mentioning.
It's just all about backing yourself. And that's really hard to do. I mean, I was lucky because I had this experience of working on the bill and in Ireland with very supportive people where this wasn't a thing. It was just like, you just have to do the job and you have to know that you can do the job. That's a big thing. And, fundamentally, you have to be able to fix the show creatively on any level if it gets in trouble. End of story. That means rewriting scripts in a few hours. It means changing a storyline if it suddenly starts to wobble. It means listening to the network when they go, we don't like that. And definitely when you're working with, like we had Disney with Gloaming, and that was enormously challenging because the woman we were working with was very particular about what she did like and what she didn't like. That could be a hair colour of an actor that we would spend weeks trying to fix. But you can't just throw your hands up and walk away. It's your problem. For example, on Gloaming, I would be told quite a few times, this $10 million we're investing is on your shoulders. But it forces you to make decisions. And then if there's a problem, you have to fix it. And nobody understands that pressure. You've just got to get trust. You've got to gain trust. But I feel like now, after doing these 2 shows, I've got certain heads of department that I'll always work with, that always have my back. And I'm always drawn to people who just want to get the goddamn job done. And it shouldn't be that hard, but it's very political in Australia.
And you cleaned up in the awards. What was that like to stand up there and go, oh, it was worth it?
It was surreal, really, because we had to try to do everything different. We wanted different framing, we wanted different lighting, we wanted different landscape. Everything was different way of storytelling and different genre. So for it to be embraced the way it was exhilarating and yeah, just to be recognised, to say, you're doing what you sort of set out to do.
And I guess there's kind of like 2 ends to that. You had to fight in your corner for a title, for the rights to be present in the story you want to tell during the writing, pre-production, production. But then at the end, when you're at the awards ceremony, what's that experience
I think it was an interesting thing that happened to me where I'm quite shy by nature. I know people don't think I am, but I'm actually quite an introvert, especially when it comes to crowds. So I think I was naturally kind of stepping back a little bit and kind of reluctant to, and you've only got like 15, 20 seconds, So anyway, there was 2 things that happened. One was Brian Walsh called me aside. Brian was this incredible mentor to a lot of people in our industry. He died a couple of years ago, which was devastating. But one of the things he said to me was, you need to step forward a little bit. That was the first sort of thing. And then this incredible thing happened where I was at a function. It was an awards night. And this woman, who I really admired, she was very high up in the business, and I'd not met her before, I don't think. She started walking towards me with a few other women who I didn't know, but they were all producers. And they're sort of walking straight towards me. And she sort of took my arm and said, we just want to have a chat. And I'm walking out thinking, oh, my God, what is this, And they kind of stood around me, and there was this circle of women standing around me in this hallway, saying to me, you need to speak up and take your place and say something. And I'm like, yeah, but I don't mind, and Vincent was a much better speaker. And I kind of had done a couple of times. I'd said, thanks. And we'd have our you thank the folks, you can thank the cast kind of thing. But they just felt quite strongly about it. And
I've got this image of like the 3 Furies, just like we are taking her and we're putting at the front of the stage.
Yeah.
And she's going to do this. Like say, talk about really guiding you to.
It really was.
Guiding you.
Yeah, it was. And I was so thrilled that night. We won an award that night, but it still resonates with me. In fact, she commented the other day on my Facebook, and I wrote back to her and said to her, you still are that woman. I'll never forget your support.
So, Vicki, could you share about a time just after the reviews came out, like if we delve into the Kettering incident, for example?
The first review of the show came out the day after it went to air, and my name wasn't mentioned. And I was devastated beyond belief. And then I drove home. We're in Hobart, and I drove back to Launceston. I cried all the way, and I'm not sure. I think it was just working so hard on something and not to be even mentioned. And for what I perceived to be such a big part of me. When I got home, I got this phone call from this producer, again, who I didn't know that well, and he said, have a look on Facebook. So I got onto Facebook, and Roger Lemaitre, who I worked with way back in Halifax, who's since retired and moved to the south of France, the lucky ducky, had read the review, and he'd put a note on it just saying, how can you review a project that's you've not mentioned the showrunner? Anyway, the reviewer didn't respond, but what happened was all these people started just adding their name. And it was all these producers in the industry that most of them I didn't know. And fundamentally, it was the industry saying, we're supporting you. And in the end, there were like 55 names on that. But you've got to hang on to people that are silently or quietly in the background pushing you on. That's what I try and hang on to. It is a shame that the naysayers or the nudges are the loudest, but that is the industry. It's a very, it's a very ego-driven industry, let's face it. And you kind of got to brand yourself, So Sally Wainwright, is an auteur. They kind of call it the auteur model. She is Happy Valley. It's a brand. She is Jimmy McGovern is a name, things like that. And yet there's a reluctance here to be too much. A couple of guys have that status, but it's hard fought and won, and you wear it with a lot of knives in your back.
I'd like to turn now to your story making and your style and the influence of fairy tales. And one of the tenements of fairy tales is leaving home. The protagonist is either taken from home like Cinderella or Snow White, but home is removed from your characters. And you've touched on that, but how do you work with fairy tales or myth? Or is it really intuitive, just what comes up, like you say, from the myths?
I would say a couple of things. Like, I love using mythology and fairy tales to tell a story. I think they are the foundations of storytelling, certainly the foundations for me of storytelling. And so I like to think, who is this fairy tale? What is the fairy tale I'm telling? So it's Persephone was Anna, but also Cassandra, the girl that would try and tell the truth but never be believed. So I always do try and follow a fairy tale and try and think of, what's the symbology of these fairy tales that I want to tell. And I love living in that space. And, there's a few similar things with all my work, but being home is one thing. Like Anna coming home and not belonging was very much my journey back from the UK, wanting to come home to Tasmania and realising that I have no life here, and realising I didn't belong was very much the start of Kettering. It was very much.
And in Gloaming, Alex in Gloaming.
And Alex,
losing home and then losing home again in Melbourne, kind of.
Yeah, and for Molly, being in a disruptive home, like she had lost everything. So I guess I start from that, and fairy tales are all about transformation. So one of the kind of things I think I'd like to look at to change the way I look at storytelling, I guess, would be taking the norm of the external, say telling a story through action, I guess, which is very much the hero's journey, to telling an internal story of reckoning. So I don't get to the end and everything's solved and fixed. It's like the character goes inward on a journey to recognise where they are in the world and what they have to do to change. But as a person trying to tell stories, for me, what I want to end up with is a kind of a legacy of truth for the character. But at the end, finding the truth of something, I think, is the way I like to tell stories. And that is following the fairy tale myth, if you like, a mythology. It's not, you've got your hero's journey to conquering, I guess. You conquer something and you achieve something. You get the elixir, you get the gold, you get the girl, you get the reward. And I think for me, it's about cracking open truth and facing the truth. And both Anna does that at the end, finding out what happened to her, and with Molly finally talking to a psychiatrist about her father and realising why she keeps repeating this. So the location to me is the most important thing, because that's where danger lurks in my world, and a lot of fairy tales as well. So home is not stable and it's not guaranteed safety. In fact, it could be the most dangerous place. So Anna says something quite significant. She's living in the UK, and when the doctor says to her, maybe you should go home, she says, I am home. And so she's denying that place of trauma. So they're going back to trauma. Molly's living in trauma, and Alex is moving into going back to trauma. So there are all those transformation stories that aren't going from the journey of who am I to here I am kind of thing. It's more like an internal reckoning, I like to call it, of through myth, through telling.
And plot or symbiology. Do you want to speak about that?
The way I like to plot is to give clues to the audience through symbology rather than heavy plot points. Like moths are transformative. There was a lot of clues in Kettering into what Anna was, what was going on. And a lot of people, say to me, God, when I watched it the second time, it was a completely different story, because in the story, I say right from the beginning, watch the moths, they follow the light. So like the moths are leading you to the story, through the story.
Could you give me an example of how you manipulate landscape in your storytelling? Or maybe not manipulate, use it to leverage your storytelling?
Just one example. I really wanted Anna to have a car that wasn't practical for the landscape. So we found this Jag that we bought for $2,000 or something. And even in your mind, without realising, subliminally, you're watching somebody in a car going in a very dangerous terrain with a car that's not practical. And when we look at something, we sense danger even if we don't know why.
Mm.
For me, that's a way of storytelling without having to say, you shouldn't be driving in that car. That's not set for this.
I love what you were saying about breadcrumbs and not signposting. But one thing that you just said then that I was like twitching at is that kind of external goal-orientated way of telling stories, like the hero's journey, which has its place. But you've just said the internal journey, and David Mamet believes that psychological nuance, internal reflection, unless it's manifested through action, is not drama. And he's been on record saying that many times. And yet there's so many, not just your work, a lot of European work as well, says otherwise. Audiences say otherwise. It is drama. And I guess in the spirit of ushering in more inclusive storytelling, which is what this podcast is about, what are your thoughts about that?
David Mamet is talking from maybe a bit of an older style of storytelling, and one that we recognise immediately, the action hero, that we're still telling those stories where the hero gets the elixir and the hero's journey. And then we have what is the heroine's journey, or, what we're telling now is stories from people that get their goals a different way. And this is where diversity opens up and enriches us, because we've always been just very American focused even. And the reason I think I love Scandi is that they think differently. They're culturally different, and the Koreans are different again. And so what we need to learn, the most important thing I think a writer can learn is who are they and what voice do you have? And because then we talk about the business side of things. So often I've worked on shows where there's just the way it works and that's the way it is. Or when people read your work, they give you notes that go back to that formula. And because it's just something that we see all the time. Because films have fringe films, we have low budget features, we have fringe world. We see really interesting French films and European films that explore, that explore the inner workings of somebody, emotionally driven stories. In TV, we're not like that. We're like a business that has to sell commercials. But now we're in streaming world, and we're all still finding our way in this, and we still have a long way to go, I think, in how we can broaden our storytelling, but we have to be allowed to. So that one of the hardest things is, for me, one of my work is left of centre. It's different way of storytelling, not hugely different, but it's different to what we're used to. So it is hard for me when I pitch. It depends who I'm pitching to, and there's got to be a particular, Foxtel are definitely looking for something new and different and elevated. And a lot of people say that, but they don't mean it. And of late, I've been to a couple of industry events, like Content London and there's Spa here, but the industry at the moment, they're saying there's no money. We want safe. We want to soft crime. You've either got to have established IP, so you've got to option books, which you can't afford, or you get them off producers and then you're bound to that producer, so you're just working for somebody, or it's got to be soft and happy crime and sunny, blah, blah, blah. The first thing that comes out that is a hit in the UK is a show called Adolescence, about a boy who stabs a girl. And I'm like, so now where are we? Do you know what I mean?
I'd like to turn to diversity, which I think is a byproduct of the Me Too era and a very welcome one, a long-awaited one. But could you speak into this?
So a couple of years ago, all we talked about was diversity. That's all they wanted, and there was money throwing around for anything that was diverse and new diverse storytellers, all that kind of stuff. And for me, it's thrilling that we are opening those doors, but it's no point just opening doors, going, we want it, and then just doing a nod to it and getting stories that are told from a white person's stock standard point of view. We've got to embrace it fully, and we still haven't done that. So, and they would say that as well. Some people I've spoken to that in that space, they're like, it's frustrating because we try and tell our own stories, then we're told we're not to. It's about definitely opening the doors to diversity, but it's also letting anyone tell their story. So try and understand. So for me, the biggest challenge with my work is to make it understandable to streamers or people I'm pitching to. Like I got told the other day, we're just looking for softer crime, and I wouldn't go too hard on the feminist sort of line that my story is suggesting. If you could tone that down a bit, it's a bit dark. I get told that all the time, But what they need to be looking at is the truth in the story. And I think for me, it's like, I understand we have to have a mass audience. So that's why I always have a crime as a spine of my story. But the really important part of my story is the internal journey of the Mollys and the Annas, but all the characters, like things like that, where you can tell an emotional truth in the story and be authentic to that, because it's a story that's bubbling up in my emotions and my emotional truth, if you like. So if I feel it, a whole lot of other people are going to feel it, because I'm being true, I'm being honest, I'm regurgitating a painful trauma that hopefully I can tell that's palatable enough for people to enjoy, because it is an entertainment thing after all. But we have to keep pushing that honesty in storytelling, and we just hope that people who are buying the shows have the maturity and the want to understand that and be able to sell it to the bigger world. But that's where the business comes in, and the two sometimes are like oil and water.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think that's where we struggle, when we are either female voices, female damaged voices, female trauma voices, even men that probably would like to tell a different story. But culturally, everybody's going to tell stories different. The only way we're going to make it diverse is to allow those stories and not keep pushing them back into a box. what you want are people to read your material and help you make it better, help you enhance it and understand it. And this is where I feel when you get working partners, and I'm talking even up there in those business worlds, who have a story knowledge, and there's a real disconnect sometimes between the people who are funding your work and the people who understand what you're trying to say. And there's nothing we can do about that because television is a business, but we keep on trying.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Because it's like what you were saying is, so the storyteller or the story maker is writing from an intuitive base, is also maybe not so aware, like, there's a father wound. The work, the story's got an inner soul that's coming through, so that's personal, but they're also, I think, deeply tapped into the intuition. But the money people aren't working from that intuition. They're coming from a completely different part of their psyche, and that's where there's
they're looking for familiarity, because this show worked, so we want another one, or there's got to be an ending that's resolute.
I'm going to ask this of every guest, but if you had a magic wand and you could restore anything into the world, what would you do in terms of anything story?
Probably. I want to say encourage writers coming through to tap into their self to find stories. I'm watching them copying rather than inventing. They're copying stories. So they're telling a story that doesn't feel truthful. It's like, but they know that that's what the industry is looking for, and they feel like that's the only way to tell the story. And I often say, being a writer it's like getting up every day and talking to this invisible psychiatrist and peeling open something you don't really want to peel open. You're trying to suppress all this trauma, but down there is the heart of who you are. And so if we could just tell those stories and not be afraid of emotions, I think we'll start to see we do see, look, I say start to, but there's a lot of amazing stories out there, but I think that we could do more with really digging in and examining emotions rather than plot points. Yeah.
Vicki Madden, thank you so much for being my guest today. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for inviting me. It's been nice to talk to you.
The Storymakers Rebellion is created on the unceded lands of the Bundjalung Nation in New South Wales, Australia. For tens of thousands of years, storytellers have nurtured a kinder, more connected world. Thank you for listening.